All right. Thank you, Luis. Appreciate that. Well, we made it. This is it. We're crossing the finish line tonight. And also, hello to those of you on the live stream. Glad to have you here. So I compared this week earlier. I don't know if you remember, but aside from Q&A panels, I guess I gave the first talk and the last talk of the week. So earlier I was chatting with somebody and I compared this to myself being the bread on a sandwich. And then I realized I don't eat the bread on a sandwich. So I'm kind of putting myself in a bad spot there. I don't know. Does anybody else not eat the bread on the sandwich? Okay, there's a few of you. So I'm asking you tonight, maybe change your habits, and entertain me for a little bit. I really am grateful to have the opportunity to land this plane for this week, and have been really grateful for all the conversations I've gotten to have with many of you. So tonight's question is, I think, one of the core questions of our time that people are wrestling with, and that's, who am I? Except tonight, specifically, we're going to be looking at who am I, God? And what does God say about us? And so as we approach this, what I'd like to do tonight is a couple things. One, I want to look at the question of identity. What does that mean? When we talk about identity or are on a quest for self-realization, self-discovery, when we're thinking about finding ourselves, what is it we're actually looking for? How do we think about what identity is in our lives and how it functions? And secondly, I want to look at specifically today, what are the messages that exist about who we are and how we form our identity in our culture today? And then finally, I want to suggest that Christianity and Jesus in particular may have some really important things to say to us about this. So I'm just going to share some of my thoughts, and I am borrowing from the thoughts of some other people. Most of the people who have impacted me as I've been wrestling with this in my own life are guys like Charles Taylor, James K. A. Smith, and Tim Keller. So if you want to read more, I can give you some sources for them. But I'm going to speak a little bit more personally tonight as well, because the question of identity, the quest for self, the quest for identity is something that I have known very personally and struggled through very personally. So first of all, when we talk about it and how you find yourself in a culture, how you actually arrive at who you are and your identity, there are three fundamental questions that must be answered to form that picture. These are the three. The first is, what is it that you're living for? What is your main thing? What are your values? Okay, I'm asking several questions, but that means one question. What's your main thing? What's your primary aim? What's your highest good in your life? That's the first. What are you living for? The second is, what is my worth? What is my worth? So based on my life, in other words, am I living up to those standards that I have? Am I actually meeting my goal, my aim? And then thirdly, who says? Who says? Where does my validation come from? Who gets to evaluate my life and validate me? These are the three. What are you living for? What's my worth? And who says? Because ultimately, our identity is comprised of two things, our sense of self and our sense of self-worth. And so these three questions must be answered. And different cultures do identity differently. And we wouldn't expect every culture to do it the same. So I'm going to use two words primarily as we think about this. One is traditionally how we've done things, and then culturally. So traditionally, I mean in the past. And if I say culturally, I mean in the present, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, and how our culture is doing things. But I specifically mean for our purposes in our context, in the Western American context, okay? That's my qualification. So how have we traditionally gone about forming identity in the past? Well, traditionally, identity was formed from the outside in. Okay, what do I mean by outside in? Well, that initial question, what am I living for? What are my values? Those things would have authority, but outside of me. So it could be something as similar as this. You're born into a family, you're born into a community, and the ideals and values that exist in your family and community apply to you. Does that make sense? Those things are outside of you, and you apply them to your internal world. It's an outside-in approach. And so whatever those values are, and if you're in a family setting, you would basically absorb those. Today, culturally, identity is formed inside out. So our culture says, if you want to know who you are, then you need to look inside at your deepest feelings and dreams. And you need to decide what those are and then tell everyone in your life, because they need to accommodate your dreams and your feelings if they're going to learn how to accept you. Does that make sense? So the difference is this. Traditionally, and for most of human civilization, when you were born into a community or a family, and you adopt the values that exist in that community or family. They exist outside of you, they have an authority, and you apply them to yourself. That's how you understand yourself in that context. Today, in the Western society, the way we think of ourselves is we define ourselves inside out. Instead of looking outside to the values of our community or our family or something outside ourselves, we look within ourselves to figure out what are my desires, my feelings, and those become our reference point for how we think about who we are. And that's why expression of those things has become very, very important. The more that we can express our desires and dreams, the more that we can actually realize who we are. So expression is a really key part of this. So in one word, traditionally, identity has been about your duties. So you're born into a family and you're given a role, or you're born into a community and you have a role. And the honor and your self-esteem will come from how well you actually fulfill your role in that community, okay? So traditionally, your duties define you. Culturally today, our desires define us. And so no matter what we're born into, our self-worth is ultimately about how you feel when you assert who you feel you are, even against what anybody else says about you, right? Your worth and your value and like who you are doesn't require outside validation. You get to do that for yourself. So there's a duty-based identity, and today we live in a society that promotes a desire-based identity. And really, there's been a massive shift in how we think about what we align our lives with. So traditionally, we used to think about what was true or right or good, and then seek to align our lives with it. So if we believed something and gave it authority, we would try to come under that. But now, instead of doing that, we do a different approach where we look within ourselves and try to align the things external to us with what we feel. Are you tracking with me? I promise we're going somewhere, so hang with me, okay? So basically, the point I want to make about these differences is both of them require an immense amount of, or actually force upon us an immense amount of pressure. So if your identity is based on a role in a community, traditionally, and you don't fulfill that role, then what happens to you? Well, your self-esteem is going to tank, right? You're going to feel the pressure and experience the feelings of failure in that context. And in our culture where your identity is based on your desires, if you're not able to realize those things and create those things and live those out, then you're also going to feel lost and inhibited because you're not actually able to realize these things. So culturally, I think we now bear the burden of creating ourselves and creating our own identities. We live in a world that says you can be and become whoever it is that you want to be and become. I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with like song titles. There's one that came out quite a few years ago called Born This Way, right? Which, regardless what that specifically is referencing, says, look, you're born a particular way. You have the desires that you have the feelings that you have. That's who you are. Now, there's a piece to that may or may not be true, but there's a deeper question here about who are we really? So this is what I want to do. To further unpack this, I want to think about why our cultural suggestion for identity doesn't actually hold up. So there are 3 reasons why I think the suggestion that we can just create ourselves and the way we should discover ourselves is look to our desires and follow those. I think our cultural narrative says, look, feel what you feel and just follow what you feel. And ultimately, they will take you to the destination that is you, okay? And I want to discuss why I think that's actually impossible. So reason number 1, sometimes our desires disagree. Sometimes they just don't agree. Casey yesterday was talking about YOLO, which, thank goodness, I never really said. You get older and you look back at these phrases and they seem so cool in the moment. But I think the cultural mantra today is you do you. Has anybody said that here? I don't know, maybe you don't want to admit it. Okay, I see some hands. I see some brave souls here. Okay, the cultural mantra is you do you. The great contemporary philosopher Ellen has said, just be yourself and it will all work out. You do you. Be true to you. But here's the problem with that. You do you doesn't tell you which you to be true to. Because we're not always in the same place with our desires. Sometimes we have competing desires. How do you do you then? Sometimes we want this thing, other things we want that thing. Sometimes we decide, I want a relationship with this person. And so we enter into it, and then we think, but I want a relationship with that person too. Do I have to choose? I guess, do I have to choose this person, that person, both people? We have choices to make, and we have conflicting desires. And I was trying to think in a sports context. Sometimes I play pickup basketball, and imagine you're in a really competitive game, and you're down by 2 points with a few seconds left, and your team's inbounding the ball, and your teammate throws it right in between you and another defender, and it deflects and goes out of bounds. And the referee says it's off on the other team. But you know that it went off of you, beyond a shadow of a doubt. But you need that possession, you need that referee's call in order to win this game or have a chance. There's only a few seconds left. So here's a moment. What do? Well, if you have integrity, you might feel the desire to tell the truth. Nah, it was off on me. The other player's protesting, like, just ask him. Friends do that when it's pickup. Just ask the guy. He knows it's off of him, and then the other guy just walks away as far as possible, not to be asked. We have these conflicting desires. In that moment, you want a chance to win the game, but you also want to be true to your integrity and maybe admit that, yeah, it's off of me, the game's over. And the fact is that if there's nothing outside of you to keep your desires in check, the strongest desire will win out. If there's nothing outside of you to determine what you should come under to decide how to distinguish between one desire and another, which one is right, which one is wrong, then the stronger desire will always win out. What the heart desires, the will choose, and the mind will justify. Our desires play a very powerful role in our lives. And there are endless scenarios like this in life where we're put in places where our desires are competing, are conflicting. Sometimes they change. Our priorities change. Our opinions change. They aren't stable. Your desires aren't reliable. Now, if you're between 17 and 19, I just want you to raise your hand for a second. Okay. How many of you keep your hand up if you would take advice from your 14-year-old self? Okay, so we have some self-esteem issues in the room, I see, okay. Now, why not? Why wouldn't you? Because you were a doofus, right? Because you knew nothing then. Now, if you're 14 in the room and you're feeling attacked, just know that this doesn't stop, it doesn't stop in life. I look back at my 17 to 19-year-old self and I think, what an idiot. Seriously, what a total moron. And guess what? When I'm 40 and I'm looking back on my 30-year-old self, I'll probably say the same thing. And so the reality is that we're just all doofuses, and we should just admit that now. But the reality is that we don't keep the same opinions. We don't have the same feelings. Our desires change, our priorities change, we change. And so if this narrative that, to become yourself, to identify yourself, you need to look inside, figure out what are your deepest desires and passions and dreams. Identify those, live out of those. What happens when they change? They don't always agree. How do you do that? There's no way to decide. I've talked to so many young people who are so confused about where to go, what to do in life, how to make a decision, because there's so much in there going on, and there's no way to really sift through it. Now we interpret, it used to be the case, we talked about outside in, inside out. It used to be the case that truth was the lens through which we interpreted our feelings. We flipped that. Now our feelings are the lens through which we interpret truth. And that's given authority in our life. That's the guiding principle. So if we follow our feelings, we can get really stuck. Our cultural identity formation, which is inside out, says don't ever let anyone else define you. You need to look inside and then you can decide. Only you can decide. Only you can validate you. No one else gets to determine what's right or wrong for you or how you should live your life. Just be like that cowboy in Old Town Road and take your horse to the Old Town Road and ride till you can't no more. And then what's the refrain of the song? Can't nobody tell me nothing. You can't tell me nothing. Basically, that song is saying, look, I'm a lone ranger. I'm doing my thing. That's what that song is about. You don't get to tell me what I'm going to do. Ain't nobody can tell me nothing. Going down the Old Town Road, that's what I'm going to do. Okay, not me, but you know what I mean. I am from Kansas, but okay. The truth is, none of us actually want to live that way. Because after enough time, that Old Town Road gets long and lonely. Nobody really wants to go down that road for that long. Why? Because we want relationship. We want people in our lives. We are irreducibly relational beings. You can't shake it. It just is how we're made. And so you look inside and decide to be a certain way. This is why that doesn't work. What if you decide to be something that everybody else thinks is horrible? Now, do they have a right to say something? I suppose they do. They might not. But are you going to go on living that way if everybody else thinks you're a monster? No. Because ultimately, even if that's how you feel and you validate that for yourself, you're going to change for a relationship with other people. We are relational beings. And if you live just trying to validate yourself and you say, I'm the only authority I need, I'm just going to tell myself this is who I am and I don't need anybody else's opinion, nobody else's validation, you will become the neediest person on the face of the earth. You will need constant affirmation and validation. And social media is not helping us in this area because it gives you easy access to instant gratification, a platform for validation. So I want to look at one example of this. I think that in our context, because our society has said you just need to be validate yourself, but we can't do that. We're not happy with that, so we seek it elsewhere relentlessly. We've become dependent on it. And I want to look at a quote from Sean Parker. This is Sean. Sean is one of the founders of Facebook. Did anybody see the movie The Social Network, where Justin Timberlake plays one of the early investors? Do you remember that? Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. That's fine. Okay. He's one of the founders, and Justin Timberlake played him, and this is what he said in an interview with Axios about Facebook. He said this: the process that went into building these applications, that process was all about how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. And that means we need to give you a little hit of dopamine every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or post. That's going to make you contribute more content. It's a social validation feedback loop. It's exactly the kind of thing a hacker would come up with. It's exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And then he leans back in his chair in the interview and laughs, like bewildered at himself, and he says, we understood this consciously, and we did it anyway. I mean, he didn't say this as just an offhanded explanation. He said this as a confession because it's tearing the fabric of our society apart. He went on to say this. He said, we compound the problem, right? We curate our lives around a perceived sense of perfection because we get rewarded in these short-term signals like hearts and thumbs up. And we conflate that with value and conflate that with truth. Now, that sounds really trivial, but it's really true. It's amazing how a little heart can affect your mood. Instead, the reality is it's not the truth. Instead, what it is a fake, brittle popularity that's short-term that leaves you even more, and admit it, vacant and empty than you were before you did it. Because then it forces you into this vicious cycle where you ask, what's the next thing I have to do now? Because I have to get that feeling back. So we live in a culture where the suggestion to all of us is you do you, be true to yourself, discover your desires and dreams, and live them out. Nobody else needs to validate or affirm it. They're yours. You just be yourself. But we're not content because we need relationship and we need validation. And so I think we're seeking it on these platforms. and I think it's reinforcing what we're looking for, but really we just feel more lost than we did at the start. So an identity that is totally based on your own self-assertion, it's too fragile. You will always end up seeking validation outside of yourself. And more than that, more than just seeking it, you will demand it. You will. It's why when people disagree with each other these days, the reaction is so strong, because it's not that you've just disagreed with me, you've denied me. You've rejected me. And that response is part of a protest about this is who I am, because we've tied our desires so deeply to our identity. So part of the problem is that you will never, if ultimately your identity is about your desires and your standards for yourself, you will never live up to your own standards. And even if you try, you won't know when you have, because it's like a moving goalpost. And so if you do something that fails your own standard, all you have to do to stop feeling guilty is change the standard, right? So it's like, oh, well, I shouldn't have, we do this all the time in life, actually. Oh, I shouldn't have cheated on that exam. Well, actually, my teacher is a tyrant and more tyrannical than any other dictator I can think of, and that was a really unfair test. So really, I'm probably warranted. And then we justify it, right? We rationalize these things. We change the standard. We play the victim card. And if you have no authority outside of you, you will do that constantly in life. You will. And here's the scary thing. This is, a clear conscience doesn't make you innocent. A clear conscience doesn't make you innocent. So you might feel like, hey, I've justified this. I'm in the clear. That makes sense why I did this. I've rationalized this. You might feel okay about it, but it doesn't make you innocent. And even more than that, the cultural sense of identity is entirely based on performance and praise. So you have to be great at what you do, smart, beautiful, interesting, cultured, and prove that to yourself and everyone else. It's massively burdening, actually, to keep up these appearances. I don't know if you've ever met anybody who is sort of Insta-famous. There's different levels of being Insta-famous. I just deleted my Instagram as a little experiment after, wrestling through some of these ideas. But, if you know these people, like sometimes Insta-famous people are some of the most insecure people you'll ever meet, because of the pressure and the constant comparison with other people that they're sort of rivaling, and the demand to produce more content that's better than the last, to bring more followers, and then have to accept the fact when the number doesn't go up that maybe you're not as good as you were before. I mean, it's an incredible psychological game that we play. So we live in this cycle of performance. So First reason why I don't think it works, because it's incoherent. In life, your desires disagree. Secondly, we all care about what people think. We need that acceptance and validation in a relationship, and we crave it. And finally, the final reason I don't think this works is because it's unstable. So typically, the way that our identity formation occurs in practice is that whatever you initially succeed at becomes the bottom line of who you are. Okay? So whenever you're a child or you're at a moment of self-discovery, whatever it is that you first get affirmed in or become passionate about, that will become the baseline of your identity. And that's fine. It's a starting point. It's not meant to be the whole thing. So for me, when I was a young kid, I was about as coordinated as a banana, okay? Like, I did not have coordination. And when I was getting older, around 10, 11, 12, something changed. And I remember the first time I was playing in a flag football game and I scored a touchdown. And I thought, holy cow, this is different. Like, this is cool. And honestly, I was hooked on that. And thankfully, I grew in physically to that passion. And I basically haven't changed since I was 12. So, by the time I was in high school as a freshman, I was our starting running back on our football team. I had emerged as an athlete. I could dunk a basketball. I could bench over 300 pounds. I was there early. So it was a different kind of thing for me. And this became my passion. It became the thing that I did. I was fast. I was getting faster. My coordination was getting better. And then at 15, after my first year, and I was kind of coming on the scene as an athlete in the region, and the first game of the season showed up, and I broke my femur. And I'll tell you, I was physically broken and it hurt. But I think the thing that was actually worse is how lost I felt in that moment. Because the thing that was bearing the weight of my bottom line identity was this thing I had succeeded in, and I poured my heart and soul into it. And then it was gone. And I was sitting in a wheelchair on the sideline with no name and no idea who I was anymore. Your identity is only as stable as that which you root it in. It's only as stable as that which you root it in. And there's so many things that you can place your identity in. You can place it in achievements. You can place it in athletics. You can place it in academics. You can place it in your appearance. You can place it in your friend groups and accessorize yourself with the kind of people you want to be around. I mean, it's just amazing. We're like little identity addicts. We just look for these little opportunities. There's so many places, but those things never last. And some people, or at least they can disappear. For those where it does last, it's rare. Some people are under the impression, well, if only I had more opportunity. It's a big reason why people pursue wealth. If I have more money, I have more time, I have more freedom. I'll be more free. I have more opportunity to be who I am. I can live freely. Warren Buffett, who has a net worth of $85 billion, said more money just makes you more of who you already are. It doesn't change you. It just amplifies what already exists there. So what is the solution here? Well, I honestly believe in the area of identity, the only real solution for us is the gospel. Truly. It's so unique and it's so different. Jesus talks about the reality of our heart, very frankly. In Mark 7:21 through 22, he says, "For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly." Jesus is saying that these are the desires of the heart. Now, if that's true, it makes sense as to why we shouldn't just follow those things wherever they lead. Because they're not reliable. They're not trustworthy. True freedom to live your life does not come when you can do whatever it is that you want to do. True freedom to be who you are is when you have the power to do what you ought do, or what you really want to do beyond it all. And Jesus alone is the source of that kind of transformation. So he says, don't follow your desires. Let me transform your desires. Let me change them. And secondly, it's a desire an identity in Christianity is secure. God is the ultimate validator. If anybody has a right to say who you are, it's the one who made you. He's the source of that truth. And this is another thing that makes Christianity different. Every other form of identity will always be achieved. It's always performance-based. In Christianity alone, you don't have to achieve it through performance. You just have to receive it in rest. Because here, the mystery of identity, at least in my journey, has been that your identity actually isn't yours. Now, if some of you look confused, that's okay. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that if it's true that God made you, that he knit you together, then he had you in mind before you did anything. And actually, what you need to do is not achieve your identity through performance, but actually just rest and receive it. Now, that's kind of a weird idea. Think about that. You existed in the mind of God before your first breath. And now, in the gift of life, we get to be on a journey of self-discovery and discovering who we are as God has made us to be. So how do we access that true identity? Well, this is where Jesus gets real with us. In John, it talks about how, in John 1, it talks about how, John 1, 12 through 13, "Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, but born of God. Now, I want you to pay attention to those two words. Children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision, but born of God. Why do I highlight that? Because there's two ways since the beginning of human civilization that we've been coming up with identity. Remember, we talked about these at the beginning. The traditional way, in family, in community, you assume a role. Natural descent, the family you're born into. And secondly, the way, you make you. And the word here in the verse is human decision. So here, John makes that distinction. I'm going to read this again. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor human decision, but born of God. In other words, this is the ultimate alternative. You're no longer in one of the two options. It's not that your identity is from the community or family you've been born into ultimately. It's not the case that your identity is a product of your efforts to achieve and perform and follow your feelings and your dreams. Your true identity will be realized only when you're born of God. Then you become a child of God. And that happens when you lay your life fully down.